You can go first.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll ask you to sit down and we will begin as our tech people do some fine tuning. We're ready to go. My name is John Henderson, and it's my pleasure to give you an informal welcome to Knox College to this event. I just want to let you know that there are washrooms down the hall and past the rotunda, past the principal's office, and they are there. We'd like to welcome those who are joining us through YouTube, and if you are going to ask a question in question and answer time, you can email me and I will pick it up and relay it to the speakers. Following our presentation today, we're going to have refreshments in the room right across the hall. And this has been prepared for us by Emmanuel College. We're very appreciative and looking forward to it. I'd like now to call on Principal Gordon to give you an official welcome.
I love the way that John talks about informal and formal welcomes, but I guess I'm the formal welcome. And so it really is my pleasure to welcome you to Knox College and to this event. And I never quite know where to look. All you YouTubers that are out there, we're glad to have you with us today as well. Knox College, as one of the colleges of the Toronto School of Theology, works closely with Emmanuel College in a number of different ways. And it is really great to partner with Emmanuel in this very, very special event. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Javier Ruiz, to stand up, the Consul General for Cuba, who is here in Toronto. He has been, during his time here, he has been a good friend to Knox College and the students that go down to Cuba each year. Just a little bit about our relationship. It began in the year 2000 when we established an educational partnership with the Ecumenical Seminary in Matanzas. And over the years, it has deepened and expanded. And every year since 2007, a group of Knox MDiv students and faculty go down to Cuba and the seminary for a week-long intercultural study tour. It really is a required course. Our students can't get out of the MDiv program until they do it. So it's a wonderful thing for us to have embedded in our program. And as part of that agreement, students from Matanzas who want to pursue graduate study are welcomed at Knox and through Knox to various places within the TST. So you can see with that relationship what a wonderful thing it is to have today's event. 5 Cuban scholars here at Knox College. I'm not sure whether I should cheekily refer to them as the Cuban 5, but I will anyway. Anyway, it is wonderful to have them here and to hear about the challenges and opportunities that are there for Cuba from the perspective of society, church, and theological education. So anyway, a very warm welcome. And I would like to ask my colleague, Mark Toulouse, the principal of Emmanuel College, to come and say a few words.
I'm formal welcome point 2. So we're pleased at Emmanuel to participate in today's panel with Knox College and happy to provide refreshments following the panel. discussion. We look forward to the discussion, and Dorcas will, after I'm done, step back up and introduce panelists and moderate today's panel. But I've been asked if I would open today's discussion with prayer. So please join me in prayer. Gracious God, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather together to discuss the challenges and opportunities within Cuba in the midst of these days of rapid change. We give thanks for the gifts, the graces, the knowledge brought by our panelists to this discussion. Place all of us in the frame of mind where we can take advantage of what it is we learned today, where we can become advocates for greater changes that will prove beneficial for Cuba and its people. With appreciation for the boundless opportunities represented in theological education, we ask for your continued blessings on our work. Amen.
Can I ask the panelists to come forward? I think they've actually organized themselves in terms of who speaks first, second, third. So. To go with Patricia first. As I look around this room, I realize that many of you know the panelists, if not all five, certainly some of the panelists, and they probably don't need a lot of introduction. But I really want to introduce them so that you can see the quality of leadership that we have in this room this afternoon. And I will introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. First, Dr. Patricia Ares, specialist in family, PhD in psychology from Havana University, specialist in family therapy, former president of the Cuban Psychology Society, and now head of a research group on the family in Cuba. Patricia has taught many years at the University of Havana and indeed in many Latin American countries and in the United States. So we welcome her. Maybe for the rest, we'll wait and applaud at the end. The next one I'd like to introduce is Dr. Reinerio Arce. I couldn't resist this because Reinerio just yesterday received an honorary doctorate from United College in Montreal. So we're affectionately calling him Doctor. But Reinerio is professor of theology at the Seminario Evangelico de Teologia, Matanzas, Cuba, master in theology from SET, PhD from Tübingen, where he studied with Jürgen Moltmann, former president of the Cuban Council of Churches, and former rector of Matanzas Theological Seminary. The Reverend Dr. Carlos Emilio Ham, the present rector of SET. 1 whole year, Carlos?
Almost 10 months.
Almost.
It seems already 5 years. 10 months.
The present rector of SET, professor of diaconia at the seminary, master in theology from SET, and a doctorate from the Free University in Amsterdam. Pastor and former general secretary of the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba, and former secretary for mission of the World Council of Churches. So Carlos came back from Geneva to his new position at the seminary. And next, the Reverend Dr. Beidy, Casas, Aragon, pastor in the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba, minister with her husband Ary, who is coming up next, partnership in ministry at First Presbyterian Church in Matanzas, Cuba. Again, Master of Theology from SET, and her Doctor of Ministry degree through the Toronto School of Theology. Beidy is a specialist in Christian education with significant experience with children and with youth. And then last but not least, the Reverend Dr. Ary Fernandez, who is a professor of theology at SET, pastor of First Presbyterian Reformed Church in Matanzas, Cuba, president of the General Council of the Presbyterian Reformed Church, master in theology, Matanzas, and he will be getting his doctor in theology at the Emmanuel College convocation a week from today. So a very special time for him. So these, my dear friends, are your panelists. Each one's been asked to speak for about 10 or 12 minutes. And so, having been to Cuba many times, I asked what the culturally appropriate way was to remind them that time was almost up. So I have 3 pieces of paper, so they every once in a while have to look at me. One says 5 minutes left, the other says 2 minutes left, and the third says 1 minute left. So anyway, we will go. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you to all of you. Patricia.
We have another mic.
Oh, yes, there's a handout one.
So I can translate.
Yo necesitaría, bueno,
¿No
porque,
quieres usar este?
no, no,
En
no,
vez de frente.
no, es nada más para pasar ahí, lo que necesitaría,
Si quieres usar eso para ponerte más de frente.
no,
Yo uso este, como tú quieras.
aquí, ok,
Oye,
¿cómo?
que vayas allá. Ah, que apuntes allá. Donde vayas.
Ah, allá,
Así que tienes que apuntar para cambiar allá.
ya. Bueno, yo soy la primera porque no soy la teóloga, la única que no es teóloga del grupo, soy psicóloga.
I'm the first. I guess I'm the first because I'm the only one in the group that is not a theologian. I'm a psychologist.
Entonces quiero hacerle una presentación un poco general sobre Cuba, nuestro país,
And I want to give a general presentation on Cuba,
sobre
our country.
su población, cómo
Its,
viven las personas,
population,
cómo es la realidad de las familias.
and how is the reality of the family.
Familia es mi especialidad.
Because family is my specialty.
Yo trabajo con familias en Cuba.
I work with families in Cuba.
Entonces voy a hacer una presentación general y ya después los especialistas hablarán de a qué población está dirigido su misión y su trabajo.
So I'm going to make a general. I'm going to make a general presentation, and then the other panelists will speak about the mission in our context of our
Bueno,
people.
como ustedes saben, Cuba es una nación insular que tiene una población, bueno, y tú lo lees.
Well, as you see, Cuba is an island. The population is a little bit more. You can see there a little bit more than 1 million. Havana is the capital. Spanish is the language. Peso cubano and peso convertible. Not even Cubans understand that, but the país is traditionally Catholic.
Como no tengo mucho tiempo, este es un dato interesante, el tema de la doble moneda en Cuba.
I don't have much time, but this is precisely a very interesting
Es
thing,
decir,
the
no
double currency in Cuba.
No es solo un dato, sino que tiene una implicación social en relación
Because
con...
it's not only a figure, but it has a social implication.
Y en relación con un cierto impacto de determinados estratos sociales que existen
And
actualmente
it has
en
an
Cuba.
impact in the different economical structures in the Cuban society.
Nosotros como país tenemos una herencia hispánica, africana,
We
una
have a-
multirracialidad,
We have a heritage from Spain, Hispanic, African. We are multiracial.
es decir, tenemos personas de distintas razas precisamente por esa herencia intercultural.
We have persons of different racial origins because of this intercultural character of our people.
A mí me gusta mucho esa foto porque sugiere un poco cómo somos los cubanos.
And I like this photo because it gives you an idea how we are as Cubans.
Si uno camina por una playa donde hay turistas en Cuba,
When you walk in the beach where there are tourists in Cuba,
generalmente canadienses,
generally Canadians
europeos,
or
muy
Europeans,
pronto americanos,
soon Americans,
encontramos que las personas están de manera individual tomando sol, leyendo su libro.
we find people individually probably reading a book,
adorando al sol, por supuesto.
taking the sunshine.
Y los cubanos vivimos la playa de manera diferente,
But Cubans, we live the beach in a different way.
porque los cubanos vamos a la playa a hacer vida social,
Because we go to the beach to make social life.
a estar en familia, a
We
estar
go
con
to be in
amigos,
families
a
with,
tomar
to
cerveza
drink with our family, with friends, and to drink beer.
y a protegernos todos del sol bajo
And
una
on the
pequeña
contrary, we
sombrilla.
protect ourselves from the sun.
Así que hay ciertas diferencias
So
culturales.
you can see the cultural differences.
Yo creo que
between
hablar
us.
de la realidad social cubana implica tres momentos importantes que son momentos de inflexión, de cambio.
I think there are three important moments of changes in Cuba.
Yo creo que no se puede hablar en Cuba sin hablar del triunfo de la Revolución Cubana a partir de
We
1959,
can't speak about Cuba without speaking about the triumph of the Cuban Revolution.
que tuvo
in
un
1959.
impacto, la revolución tuvo un impacto muy grande en toda una serie de beneficios sociales y de
The
proyectos de
revolution had
desarrollo
a
social.
positive impact on in different areas, social, economical areas.
Para los científicos sociales, un momento de inflexión importante en la sociedad cubana fue la crisis de los 90, el derrumbe del campo
the
socialista.
second moment is the crisis of the 90s when the socialist countries fell.
Excuse me. I'm just going to put Patricia over here. I'm being told the microphones are interfering.
No, ahí ya, sigue,
Ya.
está bien.
Ya, y estamos hablando de un momento actual que se habla de un momento de reforma, de la actualización del modelo
Ahí está,
económico.
pero es worse.
Aquí.
It's worse now.
Puedes irte al otro lado de la mesa porque hace feedback en el micrófono. Al otro lado de la mesa.
Oh, esto me está poniendo nervioso.
Ya.
Aquí está bien, ¿no? Y entonces estamos hablando de un momento actual de reforma y actualización del modelo económico.
Our moment now is a moment of reform and actualization of the economic model in Cuba.
Yo pondría una flecha más abajo sobre la normalización de la
And I
relación,
could put another space under is the process of normalization with the U.S.
que es un nuevo desafío y un nuevo reto.
That is a new challenge.
Entonces podemos decir que la realidad cubana ha estado movida en toda una serie de avances sociales,
The Cuban reality has to do with that movement, positive movement, social positive movement.
situaciones de crisis a partir de la crisis económica,
Since after
donde
the
hubo un
economic
descenso de
crisis,
la calidad de vida y de las condiciones de vida para una gran cantidad de familias en
where
Cuba.
there was the quality of life went down for many
Y
families.
estamos hablando actualmente de realidades sociales complejas, diversas.
So we are speaking about social realities very complex.
Tienes que mirarte para adelante.
Oh, sorry. The technology is terrible for me. Entonces, podemos hablar de que en todos esos procesos de avances sociales, aquí tenemos Cuba como uno de los países que más esperanza de vida tiene.
Cuba is one of the countries that has more expectancy of life has.
Ambos sexos de los 77 años,
For both sex, 77
hombres
years,
de 70 a 76
76 for men,
y las mujeres 80
and
años.
80 for women.
Los procesos de cambio también generaron una gran cantidad de cambios en el desarrollo de la posición social de la mujer.
The process of changes originated a lot of changes in the development of women.
Tenemos el 62% de los graduados de la educación superior son mujeres.
As you see, 62% of the graduates from the University of Women are
El
women.
63% de los profesionales y técnicos son mujeres en nuestro país.
63% of the professionals and technicians are women in our country.
Somos más profesionales las mujeres que los hombres en
We're more
Cuba.
professional, the women, than men.
Constituyen el 38% de la fuerza laboral
And we are 38% of the labor force,
y el 53% de los científicos y doctores son mujeres en
and
Cuba.
53% of the scientific and doctors are women.
El nivel educacional de nuestra población es de 9º grado,
The education level, average education level of our population is
con
9th
un
grade.
índice, y un índice de alfabetismo muy bajo, el más bajo de América Latina.
Illiteracy, very low.
La sociedad cubana ha tenido una serie de transformaciones sociodemográficas. También estamos en un proceso de envejecimiento progresivo de la población
Our
cubana.
population is aging. This is a new process in Cuba.
Hay realmente el 18% de la población es por encima de los 60 años.
18% of our population is over 60.
Hay más adultos en las familias que niños, más
There's
adultos
more
mayores.
adults in the family than children.
Sí, aquí tenemos, esta es mi abuela que muere de 105 años
This is my grandmother that died when she was 105.
y que se encontró en última etapa de la familia con sus dos hijos ya viudos
And
también.
she, in the last moment of her life, was together with her two sons, a daughter and son, that were all also old, very old.
Y nos encontramos en Cuba personas de la tercera edad cuidando a personas de la cuarta edad.
So we find people of the third age taking care of the people of the fourth age.
A esto se acompaña un índice un índice de nacimiento, o sea, un rating de nacimiento muy bajo todavía para el reemplazo poblacional.
The birth rate is very low to replace the population.
Es decir, hay 1.6 niños por mujer.
1.6 child per woman.
Y entonces tenemos una serie de situaciones que marcan o que caracterizan a la familia. Primero, los índices de fecundidad.
So the characteristic of the family is now the fecundity rate,
el envejecimiento progresivo de la población,
the aging of the population,
migraciones internas del campo a la ciudad.
internal migrations from outside the cities towards the cities.
Hay un proceso de urbanización de la
There's
familia
a urbanization process
y un saldo migratorio negativo,
and a migratory, ¿no? ¿Cómo se dice?
donde
Immigration negative.
emigran muchas personas. Entonces se imagina,
Many people immigrate.
sí,
Emigrate, ¿no?
se imaginan entonces en la familia donde hay muchas personas de la tercera edad, pocos niños y jóvenes que emigran.
So in the family you find people who are older, few children, and the young people. Many young people immigrate.
En el último censo de la población se encontró una familia cubana
In the last census, we found a Cuban family,
diversa en sus
diverse in
estructuras,
his structure,
pero más pequeña,
but smaller,
más envejecida,
older,
más urbana,
more of the city,
más globales porque tienen fronteras transnacionales,
more global because they have international frontiers.
vínculos con los hijos que
have
viven en
relations
otros
with-
países,
They have relations with their children that live in other countries.
familias de convivencia intergeneracional. Es un
So-
dato interesante en
And
Cuba.
another interesting thing in Cuba, there are different generations in a family
Pues tenemos
living together.
4 generaciones viviendo.
So you can find 3 or 4 generations in the same house.
Entonces nos encontramos un tipo de familia que tiene estas características.
So we have this typical kind of family in Cuba.
Yo quiero para finalizar hablar un poco de las fortalezas de la familia cubana.
I want to finish. You already put the sign? No, not yet, no?
Ya, fortalezas de la familia cubana.
I want to finish with the strength of the Cuban family. What are the issues of the strengths of the Cuban family?
Primero el concepto de familia. Familia en Cuba, todos somos una gran familia. Las personas
Well, in
son,
Cuba, we are a great family.
somos familias con los vecinos, con
We are
los
family with our
amigos,
neighbors, with
tenemos
our friends.
vínculos muy cercanos con redes de intercambio social,
We have
con
a
la
very
familia
strong
migrada.
network of social relations.
El acceso a la cultura y a la educación y a la salud marca una diferencia en relación con las familias de América
And the
Latina.
access to education and health makes a difference with the other Latin American countries.
Y unas amplias redes de intercambio social que son los valores sociales o el capital social más grande que tiene nuestro país.
And we have a great network of exchange in social issues that strengthen the characteristic of Cuba, and it helps the Cubans.
Ahí les dejo unas lindas vistas para el que no ha ido.
So
Se anime.
these are good photographs for those of you who have not gone.
Gracias, muchas gracias.
There you go.
I would say we're not the Cuban 5, we're the 5 Cubans. Yes, I'm going to also talk. Dorcas has a big task, no, to silent Cubans. No, that's very, very That's almost impossible. So So she's doing a great effort there because it's very difficult to silence us when we're speaking. So I'll try to be very brief. I said it yesterday. I didn't. So I'm going to speak of everybody is interested in Cuba now. Everybody and many people are going to Cuba now. And I think one of the issues has to do with the process that is long, and it will be a long process and a long, difficult process of the normalization of the relations with the U.S. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also the restructuring of our economy, as Patricia says. We are trying to make it work better in trying to maintain the social and advantage that Patricia mentioned in education, in culture, and in health. So that's a very interesting process where we began to have small private enterprises, small private business. The government is stimulating the cooperative, but at the same time, the economical crisis, as Patricia mentioned, gave the Cuban people very low the economical possibilities of the people. And we haven't yet arrived to the moment we say that you don't see those changes in the table every day, in your dinner table every day. So it's a process where still there are very strong economical problems in our country. In this process is to try to make the economical changes, maintaining the system that could help the majority of our people. That's one of but the other problem is in the relation with the U.S., the impact of the embargo or blockade, as we call it, but also we had to make changes in our economical system in a way that will be more effective. So there's the two elements that are taking influence in the Cuban reality at this moment. So the relations, I always say that the history of Cuba, almost since the middle of the 19th century, is the history with the U.S. It has been a very difficult because we are so close, and well, you're closer than we are, but we're still very close to the U.S., and that has shaped our history in a way, with two forces. And I'm mentioning that because it's a concern of many of us now. With two forces. One, the independent nationalistic movement in the 19th century against Spain, but at the same time, it developed an annexionist movement that has been struggling. And we have been lucky that the nationalist movement has won in this process. But there has been different moments in our history that has shaped that tension between annexionism and independence of Cuba. And that has to do with the Cubans and with the US, no? You know, the Monroe Doctrine, Cuba was like the apple that it will be, when it gets madura, como tú dices, right? When the apple gets ripe, it will fall in the hands of Uncle Sam. And that was said at the end of the 19th century. So now, with the changes in Cuba and with this new situation, also these tensions are there. So from one side, in the U.S., those who have a friendly and in a position to so we can live as neighbors, and at the other side, those who believe in that doctrine of the ripe apple, and at the same time in Cuba, the same. So there are those, and with a great population of Cuban Americans also in the U.S., especially in Florida, that has shaped, especially the old generation, has shaped the policy of the U.S. towards Cuba. So that's one of the things that are in this moment beginning to be a reality in Cuba, and that's the struggle in that aspect in Cuba at this moment. I think we have our strength in, as Patricia was saying, our identity as Cuban, our culture as Cuban, but still, this is a moment of big challenges because this I call it not colonialism, this neo-colonialism forces in the US are still there, in a very interesting moment for Latin America also. So we are living in Latin America, not only in Cuba, a very challenging moment for our identity as Latin Americans in our continent. I wanted to talk a little bit also, to finish that, also the concern of many, and many of you also, is the impact once the travel restrictions from the US government are lifted, the impact of tourism in Cuba, in the massive way of impact. We just received the first cruise ship last week, and about 700, I think, Americans came in that ship, but you can imagine 2 or 3 ships every day, and that will have an impact. And we have to prepare for that, and we have to be aware of that, of the good things, economical good things, the positive things of the relations with the US, but also the challenges to maintain our culture, our identity as a nation. I wanted also to speak up a little bit. We're going to speak about that in the panels, about that religion in Cuba. The colonial forces Spanish brought to Cuba Roman Catholicism. It was part of the colonial system in Cuba and like in Latin America. It's a difference between Cuba and Latin America, because the Aborigines in Cuba were exterminated after 10 years of colonization. So we don't have a strong influence of our Aborigines. There are some words, there are some areas in Cuba where you can see that maybe they are descendant from Aborigines, but they were almost totally exterminated in Cuba. So there was not, like in the rest of Latin America, an influence of the Aborigines religion at that moment. So the first religion that we had was the Christian Roman Catholicism. The Protestants came to Cuba at the end of the 19th century. It's very interesting, and that's something that some church historians forget. The origin of the Protestant churches in Cuba were by Cubans, independent fighters that had to go to the US as exile because they were persecuted by the Spanish government, and came back in a moment that there was an amnesty. So the founders of the Protestant mainline churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, those and Episcopals, they were Cubans that came back to Cuba with a very strong, independent, we call Cuban patriots, Cuban patriots, because they were very related with the independence struggle against Spain. Once the last independent war began in 1895, they were so committed that they closed the sanctuaries and went with the independent movement. We had the invasion of the US in 1898, and with them came the American missionaries to Cuba, with all the denominations that you have in the US. And many of these first founders were taken away from the side apart, no? From the churches in Cuba. So then we were part of the US churches. And that played a very important role at that moment in our first period of the Republic. Because we were the missionaries that came to Cuba, and that has to do with the ideology behind that, were national mission. The programs that came were not the international missions in the US, but national missions in the US. So we were organic part of the churches in the US. Sometimes very ridiculous, because, for example, in my church, the Presbyterian Church, we were a presbytery of the Synod of New Jersey. So we could have been a presbytery of the Synod of Florida. But because of the organization of the American churches, we were part of the church in New Jersey until 1967, after the revolution. But also a very important issue, culturally and religiously, is the African influence that we have. Very at the beginning, the Spanish brought African slaves. And they slowly brought more and more, and they those slaves brought their religion. And they were, in a way, evangelized by the Roman Catholic. They had to have a Christian name, but in the barracks, and they continue to worship their own religions. The main group that were brought to Cuba was the Yoruba people in Nigeria, in the area of Nigeria. Also, the Congo in Africa were brought also to Cuba as slaves. But the majority was the Yoruba people, and they brought the Yoruba religion, called now in Cuba Santeria, because it's a syncretic religion between Roman Catholicism and the Yoruba origin religion. So you have a Christian name that's a Christian in the Roman Catholic Church, a saint of the Christian of the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church, and it has an African name. So San Lazarus, for example, is Babaluaye, and San Lazarus is the bishop of France. Many historians say he's the brother of Martha and Mary that went to as missionary to France and so on. But for the Santeros, is Babaluaye, and it's not that San Lazarus of the religion, is Lazarus from the parable of Lazarus and the rich, because Babaluaye has to do with health. And Lazarus in the parable is the one who has leper, is with the dog, and so on. Interesting thing I wrote about that, no? The 17th of December, is the day of San Lazarus. And the 17th of December was 5 minutes. And the 17th of December was the day that our two presidents announced the normalization of the relation. So many people say San Lazarus or Babaluaye is working in healing, in a way. But that's very strong in our people. And then we have other religions, like Spiritism. It's very strong, especially in the center of the island and in Havana. I thought Spiritism came from France. Reading recently, I found that actually the Spiritism came to Cuba from the US during the Civil War in the US. It was very strong because the people who lost in the war, their relatives wanted to relate with their spirits, and they brought the Spiritism to Cuba. Then we related the Spiritism movement in France with the origin of that movement. But we also have Muslims, a very small group of Muslims. The Jewish community is very active also. In Havana, we have 3 synagogues, and there are other synagogues in the rest of the countries. We have Baha'is, we have Buddhists. So those are small groups. The largest groups are the Christians, Roman Catholic, Protestant, historical Protestant, mainline churches, Protestant, and evangelicals, what you call evangelicals, Pentecostals, as expression or manifestation of the Christian. What are the challenges for us now, and probably the other panelists will talk about that. What are the challenges in this moment, especially in the Christian aspect? One, the Roman Catholic Church that was official, the church in the colony, was the unofficial church during the period between 1902 and 1959, and was in confrontation, very strong confrontation, because it lost a lot of properties, because they were very engaged also in the Batista regime at that moment, that had a very strong confrontation with the revolution. They are reshaping slowly their position in the Cuban reality. And actually, it was very positive that the Roman Catholic Church took part in the secret negotiations, the Vatican, between our two governments, the government of Cuba and the government of the US. But there's a reshaping of the position of the Roman Catholic Church. And that, some of us are concerned about that. At the same time, in this moment, when we are now in a process of normalization of the relations, the Protestant churches played a cultural and ideological role at the beginning of the Republic, in bringing the American way of thinking, the American way of life, and even the American way of worshiping. Now, we sang translated hymns. We had the hymn books of our churches in the US, And that was ideologically, theologically, a big challenge for us at that moment. So now, many of us is the concern how the Protestant movement, and especially the evangelical right Christian movement in the US, is going to try to influence in that way in Cuba. And I think that's a point that, and maybe Carlos will talk about that, theological education is so important. And the relation also with our brothers and sisters in Canada is very important. So we have that struggle with these groups with a very strong One? Okay, with a neo-colonialist interest. And that's one of the things that concern us at this moment more, and that we have to analyze, we have to do theological, and we have to do theological training in a way. So those are the big challenges in the religious aspect that I wanted to mention to you, and then maybe in the discussion, if you have questions, we can continue.
Dorcas, do you allow me to speak from here? Yes, because I need to read from the computer, okay? Buenas tardes. Many Spanish-speaking people here, so I'll continue talking in Spanish. Thank you very much for the invitation of being with you here this afternoon. And it is really a blessing and a great privilege for us to be part of this panel. The little boxes, these black boxes here, are to control our time, or what are they for?
They're mics.
Ah, they're mics? Ah.
American.
Okay. Well, we are supposed to deal with the issue of challenges and opportunities from the perspective of theological education. First of all, I would like to speak in particular in reference to the Matanzas Theological Seminary. We have 14 theological seminaries in Cuba, and the Matanzas Seminary, Matanzas is a city that is 60 miles, well, 100 kilometers east Havana. Our seminary is the ecumenical seminary in Cuba. The Cuban Council of Churches was founded in 1941, which means that it's celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. And one of the fruits of the founding of the Cuban Council of Churches was precisely ecumenical theological education. The leadership of the churches at that time felt that it was important to form new pastors, to form the new leadership of the churches, not only clergy, but also laity, from an ecumenical perspective. There has been a trend, unfortunately, to dismantle that mindset of training theologians ecumenically, the same way that there has been a tendency towards the strengthening denominationalism as opposed to ecumenism. That tendency or that trend is reflected also in theological education. So we are struggling, that's one of the first challenges that I wanted to share, struggling very, very hard to keep the ecumenical vision of theological training. By the way, this is a trend. I am not so sure about Canada, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is a strong trend. It's not happening only in Cuba. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the theological institutions that are ecumenical, those are the ones that are most in crisis, no? So it's really a big challenge, a big struggle to keep our seminary alive. The seminary was founded in 1946. That means that we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of our seminary non-stop. We have been serving the churches in Cuba for 7 decades with ups and downs, but without closing our doors, even in the most difficult times. We have a number of celebrations of the 70th anniversary, the same way that Patricia made a commercial of the beaches, Cuban beaches. I'm going to make a commercial also. We're celebrating from the 1st to the 5th of October, a symposium on the relevance precisely on ecumenical theological education and on the relevance of the Protestant thought. As you know, next year we're celebrating the 500 years of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and therefore we want to deal with the relevance of the Protestant theology or thought. So we're going to have this symposium from the 1st to the 5th of October, and you are most welcome to join us in that celebration. We currently have 530 students in 3 different programs. The residential, these are basically the ones that are going to become pastors. There are 15, both single or with their family, their children. We also have another program that is semi-residential. That means that we have students that come to our seminary and spend 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. For example, we have a master's degree starting this week, a session where we're going to have Nestor and Becca are going to come to Cuba to teach for that master's degree. They come also for other courses. We have, for example, School for Diaconia, 5 encounters in which the same class comes for 5 different encounters. And then we have for the ones of extension, the professors go out to different locations throughout the island in order to teach, which means that we can reach out more people in our quest for theological formation. And we have, well, I was 2 years old when the Cuban Revolution triumphed. That means that I was raised in Cuba almost all my life. And we were raised in a situation of where our resilience as Cubans in general, but as Christians in particular, was pretty much developed. For some people, challenge means the end of the story. Challenge can be as strong that it can crash you. But for us, as a definition for Cubans, a challenge is already by definition an opportunity. So to a certain extent, there is, for us as Cubans, there is like a duality between challenges and opportunities. In 1976, in our first constitution of the revolution in Cuba, there was a clause, an article in the Constitution that said that we, as Cubans, are educated according to the scientific conception of the world established and developed by the Marxism, Leninism, which meant that many of members of the Communist Party went actually to study Marxism and Leninism in Moscow, and the atheism, scientific Marxist-Leninism, atheism was imposed in our country, and we are a very religious country, population. This is why we had a very, very important meeting, a number of 75 Protestant leaders with Fidel Castro. I'm sorry I don't have much time to talk about that, but it was a 6-hour meeting with Fidel, 2nd of April of 1990, where we discussed all this issue to the extent that we felt that the Marxist, atheist, let's say, emphasis of our state was producing in our country double standards. On the one hand, you had to deny your faith to have some sort of a social, political development in Cuba. And on the other hand, coming back home, then you were free to profess your faith. It's important to clarify, nevertheless, that there's a big, huge difference between the way in which our government understood and practiced this Marxist-Leninist policy compared to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Eastern European countries, where Christians were actually persecuted openly and put into jail because of their faith. It was not our case in Cuba, thank God. But that meant that we went through a more subtle type of discrimination by which we were not allowed as religious people to study journalism, foreign affairs, psychology, and other type of careers in which we would have an influence in the ideology of the people. And we had the opportunity to discuss all these issues with President Fidel Castro in 1990, which produced a tremendous, let's say, 180 degrees change in our country, to the extent that there was a referendum, a popular referendum in 1992. Our constitution was amended, and all this part in reference to the scientific conception of the world established and developed by Marxism-Leninism was crossed out, was deleted from the Constitution. Therefore, we have now what we call a secular constitution, Constitución laica in Spanish, which meant that the churches then had many more opportunities. Reinerio and I studied together in the Seminario of Matanzas in the 1980s. We were 4 students at that time. 4 students, and I just mentioned and 2 Africans, no? Out of which 2 were Africans, no? And we have more than 530 students now registered. So imagine how the situation, the relationship between the state and the church has changed, that is reflected precisely in these numbers, in these statistics of people studying theology. So one of the challenges today in this new situation is to update our curriculum. Dorcas, how am I doing with the time? 5 minutes. Oh, okay, I can say a lot of things in 5 minutes. Okay, so we're in the process of updating our curriculum as we speak. To try to adjust theological education to the new reality that we're living in our country today. Now the churches are more strongly urged to play a more active role in the Cuban society. And Reinerio mentioned in the first half of the last century, 20th century, many of the Protestant churches, mainline and Catholic churches for that matter, many had private schools. So there was a strong social engagement of the churches. At the beginning of the revolution, the schools were nationalized. The church schools were nationalized not because they were of the churches, but because they were private. That was one of the important achievements of the Cuban Revolution, to introduce free health care and education. But many of these institutions, or many of the, let's say, buildings where the church, the state has developed the classes, free classes, have formerly belonged to the churches, no? So that means that our generation, we grew up in a system in which we were able to live freely our faith, but in a private way. We could not carry out a diaconal project, for example. Now, this project that Chris Levan and a group of us are trying to sort out, which is to put up a pizzeria in a church, no? That's joint venture. It is something that we are not prepared for. And Patricia, I think, and Reinerio mentioned that the Cuban state is in the process of decentralizing the economy. So we are in the process of empowering the civil society to serve the people, and the churches are part of that. both institutionally, church institution, as well as Christians. But we have found ourselves as a theological institution that we're training just pastors, no? To do their job within the four walls of the sanctuary. So the big question now is, how can we develop an ecumenical theological education that helps us to form new community facilitators, those that can do great exegesis and hermeneutic, not only of the Bible, of the biblical text, but also exegesis and hermeneutics of the context in which we are living. That's one of the biggest challenges that we are facing today as a seminary. I think Reinerio mentioned that we have one of the problems that we're facing today is the introduction in Cuba of new fundamentalist denominations. Many of them are creating a lot of divisions. They come and they ask, for example, Ary, how much do you earn? I'm not asking you to respond. How much do you earn? You earn $30 per month? No. I will less than that. 20, 22. Okay, so I will pay you $100 if you become a pastor of my church.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of so-called missionaries, that I call them rather mercenaries,
Yes.
that come with tourist visa to recruit pastors. The problem are not the missionaries or the mercenaries, but the Cubans that are allowed to be sold, no? But it has also an impact in theological education, because many of these people, many of these churches are lowering the standards of theological education, trying to sell what my brother Reinerio calls microwave degrees. Isn't that your microwave degrees? Ary, how much years did you have to study on your PhD here?
7 years.
7 years, okay. One of these mercenaries come and say, I'll sell you a PhD degree in $150. Why? You don't have to go to the seminary. We are facing situations like that, and it's a challenge for an institution like ours, a prestigious institution, recognized internationally because of its academic standards. 1 more minute to go. The seminary is, we try to see it as a laboratory of the ecumenical movement, and therefore, I think another challenge is, as part of the learning process, we need to do more research. We have to do research on religious dialogue and cooperation. We have to do a lot of more research on the complexities of human sexuality. We have to do more research on the relationship between gospel and the Cuban culture, in a moment in which we are in a cultural battle with the USA. It sounds very simple that Obama came and nothing has happened in the past, and Chanel as well, but the president of the United States, no, he says we don't want to introduce any change in Cuba, and the strategy is to try to change our political system through cultural means. And the churches are part of that process, both of promoting an American way of life, culturally speaking, and we have a great responsibility as churches to preserve our own culture. And I'm sorry I don't have much time to deal with that. We need to strengthen our publications. We have a Cuba Theological. We have Vidaje, we have magazines, and it's a paradox that we can't find enough Cuban authors to write. Because we are too busy, or we belong more to the oral tradition than to sit down and to put things in black and white. So that's one of the challenges. I think that for those like Ary and Beidy and Reinerio, all of those that we have had the chance to study in a more black and white culture, which is to put in writing our thought, is a challenge for us to introduce that in our seminary in order to publish a bit more the theology that we are producing. We need to strengthen our communication strategy. No time to develop that. We have to work towards self-sustainability. 95% of our budget is supported by our partners abroad. 95. No time to develop that. Perhaps we can do it through questions. And finally, two more final challenges. We need to purchase a building. The Seminary of Matanzas needs to purchase a building in Havana, in the capital, to further develop our ecumenical institute of ecumenical studies of science of religion. And finally, we need to integrate better theory and practice. Therefore, we have to work more closely related with our churches. The seminary is not an end in itself. The purpose of the seminary is to work to serve the churches, and therefore we have to work, I think, more closely with our churches, not only through our board of directors, but also systematically, in order that our students have a good practical training the weekends, as good is their training from a theoretical point of view. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the organizer of this panel for the opportunity to talk briefly, I will do that, about the challenges and opportunities for youth and women in Cuba from my pastoral experience and perspective. These two groups are the closest one to me in my ministry in the Presbyterian Church in Cuba, as well in the personal and family level. I would like to start talking about youth. In my local church, as well as at the presbytery level, at the provincial level, there are always opportunities to listen to them discussing about their worries and concerns. For example, when they finish university and the salary won't be enough to rent a place, so they will have to continue living with their parents, grandparents, and other relatives. So based on my experience among youth at church, I would like to highlight some concerns that I see this group is facing right now and how my church and myself can accompany them. Addressing these challenges may need further thoughts, and writing about them is always a tough task. But I would mention some that I see as the most challenging. Like in other countries or places, youth in Cuba face limited professional possibilities in terms of jobs that they can get after they finish university, and jobs that can offer them an adequate, fair income for living. Youth also face limited participation in the public political life. Besides the official spaces created by the youth organization that is supported by the government and defends the state's interests. However, there is a phenomenon that is relatively new in Cuba. That is the extracurricular help that the students need in order to approve the national test to enter to the university. We call it repasos, tutoring. Is that right? When I returned home from Canada, I realized that the Presbyterian youth were less engaged in church activities. I am talking about local, provincial, and the national level. And one of the reasons some of them gave me was, we need tutoring. We need after-school programs. School hours are not enough. So it points to some difficulties at the school season that I won't talk right now. But it also showed that there is a challenge for them that the church needed to address in some way. So after months, thinking, talking to other people, praying about that, about what we could do, we started a program for high school students, offering them tutoring on Spanish, history, math, chemistry, physics. We started this program not only for youth from church, but also for youth from town, and we are still getting applications. Another challenges adolescents and youth are facing right now in Cuba is a limited comprehensive formation and vocational opportunities. Right now, there are many adolescents and youth who live without their parents because these emigrated or are working overseas for the Cuban government. Some of these workers go to places like Venezuela for 1 to 3 years. For that reason, some of the youth and adolescents live with their grandmas or family friends or close relatives. There are others who live with one of their parents. Many of them have not extracurricular activity and spend most of their free time at home doing nothing at all. There are others who are constantly exposed to negative social behaviors, to toxic environments, prostitution, corruption, domestic violence, to name a few. And for most of them, the opportunity to have some fun, to spare time doing educational activities is very limited. For this reason, we are trying to figure out how to minister to adolescents and youth, helping them to build community skills, civic formation, and spiritual values through music and theater, in accordance to the ethic of the reign of God, based on scripture and Cuban cultural traditions. The goal is to give them some space for entertainment, to contribute to their spiritual growth, and develop their gift and artistic potentials. There is a wish to focus on music and theater as a way of embracing some of their challenges. I hope youth ministry inspires them and gives them some possibilities to reach fullness and to embrace their Cuban identity, talking about Americans, and Christian ethical values, solidarity, respect, equality, which are other challenges among youth as well. Similar things could be said regarding women's situation. Of course, women's reality in Cuba are very complex and diverse, and I cannot describe them here. I just want to mention some features of women with whom I work in my church, some of their main challenges and concerns, and what we are doing as a church to respond to them. The group of women of my church is mostly comprised of retired women who generally live on their own and may be professionals or not. Professional women who are doctors, women, university professors. Another group who may or may not be professionals, but who prefer not to work for the states because they don't receive enough income or incentive. Incentive? What do they have in common besides their faith? There is a common sense of not satisfaction. They depend economically on others. The younger generation depend on their husband, many of them. Most of them don't feel personally realized in terms of what they do for living, how they live, the life conditions, the difficulty to satisfy their basic needs. Life is expensive in Cuba and salaries are very low. Some of them also share the complexity of family relations and dynamics and the suffering of foreseeing their sons and daughters leaving the country. Similar to youth, women need a space where they can be able not only to speak about their situation, their dreams, but also to put in place their own abilities, gifts, capacities for the sake of themselves and the whole community. In that sense, in our church, we are developing 2 diaconal programs oriented to satisfy some of these needs. First, a women craft group that meets every week. Besides making jewelry, banners, liturgical accessories, this space has become the connection between young women who are eager to participate in a different environment more than staying at home, and senior women. It also is a space to voluntarily socialize and develop their creativity and their gift to work and to create some good for the community and for them as well. This is a place to encourage each other, to share concerns and achievements, and to pray for each other and for the community. A second program that Matanzas Church has developed for many years is a feeding program for very low-income seniors. Most of them are women and they don't go to church. This program is developed by women from church who are organized in duets. That word is hard for me. Duets. Those. To prepare the food and to have different activities every week. For example, talks about history, aging, Bible studies, meditation, exercises, etc. Last but not least, I would like to mention that unfortunately, the revolutionary process that took place in Cuba didn't overcome realities deeply rooted in Cuban culture and society, such as gender discrimination, domestic violence, etc. And from my pulpit, I am also talking about this reality that some women are still suffering. The law is still very limited and cultural bias are even stronger. But in the light of this reality, talking about it, and also the creation of communitarian spaces of interrelationship and real social participation become necessary conditions to transform the Cuban society into a more emancipatory and democratic socialist. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I want to join my friends and colleagues here, thanking the organizers for this opportunity and thanking you as well for being here and sharing with us this opportunity. The organizer asked me to talk about decolonialism or decolonial thinking, which is a very theoretical issue. So I don't know if it's going to be boring or not, but my colleagues and good friends here have talked about the shifting context in which we live and work in Cuba, and how those critical socioeconomic situations, government policies, and economic transformation have contributed to the emergence and re-emergence of social dynamics that have made the Cuban reality much more complex, diverse, porous, and interesting. They have also referred to different ways in which those situations and changes, particularly in light of the so-called process of normalization of relation, diplomatic relation, and maybe commercial relations between Cuba and US governments, are affecting or may affect people's everyday life, churches' views of their mission, and theological reflection and theological education in Cuba. Clearly, Cuba is at a crucial crossroads in its history. Heated debates about the revolution's continuity and its legacy, and Cuba-likely future scenarios are increasingly taking place inside and outside of the island. For many Cubans, including ourselves, the advances made during the revolutionary period it's very important to start serious discussion about the future, appreciating the advances made during the revolutionary period, but also recognizing the failures addressing certain social and economic challenges that persist even today. The crisis and the measures and reforms gradually implemented by the government to respond to it have shown that many of the social maladies that were believed to have been eradicated or significantly lessened were in fact still part of the cultural ethos and woven into the socialist political economic too. In various ways and degrees, new voices in the Cuban society have emerged, seriously questioning and critiquing the present social structures and relationships that allowed and even reinforced the existing levels of economic and socio-cultural disparity based on racial, gender, and sexual discrimination, and demand more spaces and opportunities of social and political participation to overcome those realities. Together with the emerging newer social voices, for some time now, newer theological subjects and perspectives are being articulated. While previously absent, Issues related to disability, racial, gender, and sexual discrimination in society and churches have started to occupy a more relevant place in theological reflections and pastoral concerns. Some of these voices have been present in Latin America and among Latinos, Latinas in North America since the 1970s. But it is only more recently, especially in Cuba, that they have gained prominence in the theological landscape. As some theologians and scholars claim, liberation theologies, especially in Cuba, need to critically address the multifarious character of power relations by using a more holistic approach. For Otto Maduro, for example, the acknowledgement of and critical reflection on the dynamic and rich diversity and complexity of people's everyday life constitutes one of the main challenges and tasks for liberation theologies at the present historical context. He argues that this reflection must include the ways in which patriarchy, colonialism, racism, and other socio-historical forms of domination and exploitation influence our understanding of society and our interpretations of theological concepts and terms such as God, Trinity, the Bible, salvation, church, mission, evangelization, and so on. What is also required, he says, is a critical reflection on the historical, social, and cultural premises of our interpretation of reality and ways of constructing knowledge, including theological knowledge, and the ethical and political implications of such epistemological practices. Maduro's comments about the need for opening new paths of critical theological reflection within liberation theologies in Latin America, the Caribbean, and among Latinos and Latinas in North America resonate with the proposal advanced by several scholars associated with the Latin American Latino Research Project of Modernity Coloniality. These scholars explore the complex process of hierarchical configuration of classes, genders, races, sexes, knowledges, and spiritualities as part of the formation of the modern colonial patriarchal capitalist world system. Instead of using multiple isolated and hierarchically distinguished analytical approaches to specific historical forms of oppression and domination, be they related to class, gender, sex, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, or environment, they propose an analytical framework that integrates the myriad loci, local, national, global, at which such oppressive and unjust realities and their structural causes intersect each other. Simultaneously, the members of the Modernity Coloniality Research Project advocate the delinking from the Eurocentric epistemological paradigm that has led to the configuration of the Western imaginary and its universalizing logic. As I see it, the decolonial term encompasses three main critical, interpretive, and epistemological strategies with the purpose of exposing, critiquing, and overcoming the socioeconomic, cultural, and intellectual epistemic legacy of modernity coloniality in Latin America. First, in exploring the process of constitution and historical development of the modern colonial capitalist world system across the Atlantic Ocean during the 16th century, they critically analyzed the complex colonial matrix of power put in place as part of this process. Aníbal Quijano, for instance, argues that the colonization of Latin America involved the imposition of a pattern of domination based on the control of the processes of production and reproduction of life in different spheres: labor, nature, sex, subjectivity, and institutional authority. This pattern of domination, which he calls coloniality of power, was built upon the hierarchical and homogenizing sociocultural and ethno-racial classification of colonizing and colonized populations. The phenotypic differences between the colonizers and the colonized were racialized and culturalized in a hierarchical manner. The European white male heterosexist identity was imposed and assumed as superior over the other homogenized ethnocultural groups. This ethno-racial classification, Quijano says, facilitated the naturalization of the Eurocentric colonizing control of territories, natural and human resources, and subjectivity understood as production of knowledge and relation between subjects. Thus, the racialization of power relation became an expression of the Eurocentric pattern of colonial power and also contributed significantly to legitimize it. This exercise of social and racial classification was consubstantial with the incipient processes of accumulation of capital. Coloniality of power refers not only to the spatial temporal coincidence of hierarchical classification of the world population and the international division of labor, a structure in a center-periphery relationship, but also, and more important, to the mutual instrumentality as part of the complex process of capitalist accumulation. The political independence of the colonies in Latin America and the consequent nationalization processes didn't mean the dismantling of the colonial structures and relations of power. The subalternization and marginalization of significant sectors of the population continued at worse levels than during the colonial period as a consequence of the dominating practice perpetuated by Creole oligarchies. Coloniality of power, the colonial theoreticians claim, continues to operate at present in more complex and surreptitious ways, now camouflaged with globalizing socioeconomic and cultural processes. And we have been talking about that. Inextricably linked to the previous critical interpretive strategy, these scholars propose a second one, to transgress the hegemony of Western modern colonial imaginary by delinking from Eurocentric epistemological perspectives and ways of thinking. Through the articulation of categories such as transmodernity, geopolitics of knowledge, colonial difference, border thinking, epistemic disobedience, and coloniality of knowledge and being, they seek to unmask the geopolitical and cultural local character of Eurocentric forms of subjectivity and knowledge, including languages, and their imposition violently in no few occasions as universalizing truth. Thus, we see the strong criticism of Eurocentrism as a key component of modernity coloniality. As they write, the formation of the modern colonial world system through the implementation of globalizing projects, civilizing missions, Christianization, and modernization meant not only a process of geopolitical, economic, cultural, and religious expansion and domination. It also signified the imposition of languages and forms of knowledges, imaginaries, assumptions, rationalities, categories, and scientific theories that contributed to the universalization of Eurocentric and North Atlantic conceptions and expressions of human life, society, culture, and knowledge. This epistemic disobedience, understood as transgression of Eurocentric epistemologies, becomes a twofold move because it also implies an opening to alternative contesting forms of knowledge. This is the third epistemological strategy, the restitution and incorporation of marginalized ethnocultural experiences, memories, spiritualities, manners of constructing and organizing knowledge, primitive imaginaries and forms of interpreting reality, and devalued languages and ways of expression. Appropriately understood, disobedient and transgressing subaltern ways of thinking have been present in Amerindia since its colonization. Mignolo, Enrique Dussel, and others find the precursors of decolonial thought in this long-standing tradition of indigenous, including pre-Hispanic ones, Latin American and Afro-Caribbean voices resistant to the European and later North American imperial colonizing legacy. These traditions constitute the main critical sources for their modernity coloniality research program and become part of the decolonial genealogy. Decolonial scholars are increasingly paying attention to the role played by theoretical and intellectual currents such as philosophy of liberation, dependency theories, Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, or popular education, and liberation theologies as well, on the understanding of Latin America's coloniality and the articulation of decolonizing critiques of the modern colonial capitalist world system. With all the methodological and hermeneutical limitations that one could find in retrospect, in light of more recent theoretical developments, liberation theologians' articulations also express early steps toward an epistemic and hermeneutical delinking from Eurocentric theologies dominant in the academia and both Catholic and Protestant churches. Liberation theology was not merely a different interpretation of classical theological doctrines from a different place of enunciation, but a reconfiguration and redrawing of theological horizon and hermeneutical methodology. Liberation theologians not only changed the content of the theological conversation with the Eurocentric dominant theologies, whether classic liberal, neo-orthodox, or political ones, they also shifted the very term of theological articulation. However, my suggestion that liberation theology should be considered part of the colonial tradition of thought doesn't mean that they were and are exempt of reproducing and reinforcing Eurocentric modern homogenizing epistemological viewpoints, and do not need to be challenged and enriched by other cosmologies, spiritualities, epistemologies, and hermeneutics. I can affirm a twofold relevance of the colonial approach to liberation theologies. First, it helps understand the diverse ways in which liberation theologies already represented key moments in the repeated eruptions of the decolonial attitude. Second, the decolonial epistemological turn brings to light the various ways in which liberation theologians still fail to challenge important elements of the colonial matrix of power. In my opinion, decolonial thinking provides one of the most promising critical lenses today for reconstructing theological frameworks for addressing the capitalist modern colonial legacies in the continent and beyond, and the myriad intersecting forms of exploitation, oppression, and marginalization as a result of such a complex historical process. In the current context of Cuba, this is especially relevant. The contribution of this intellectual project for liberation theologies also lies in its call to rethink the very structures of acquisition, construction, and reproduction of theological knowledge, and to interrogate the ways in which these theological articulations perpetuate and reinscribe the colonial agenda and project. Moreover, the implications of decolonial thinking go beyond strictly intellectual issues. It also promotes the integration of multiple discursive practices and political actions oriented to decolonizing political, economic, sociocultural, ideological, epistemological, and intersubjective relations and structures of domination. Thank you very much.
I'm going to suggest you stand up for a minute and shake a little bit, and then we'll be open for questions.
Yeah. This is a decolonial exercise.
No. La mayoría no sabe cómo colonialismo aquí. Traten.
¿Me puede esto?
No, tres Cuba no, nomás que mencioné eso.
Práctica pastorales de colombiano colonizante. ¿Qué tú crees? Ok, tiro para allá, por cuestionó todo.
All right, that's enough. Shake them up. It's time for us to move to some questions. Your turn to engage our panelist. Joan here is going to be the keeper of the microphone. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, Inky there at the back, Joan, has one. Just stand up and she'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. And you mentioned that the Aboriginal people have been completely exterminated. And then with the new normalization with the US, you are very concerned with the preserving the culture that will not be influenced by this neo-colonialistic culture. And what is that critical culture that you try to preserve when Aboriginal people's culture has been totally exterminated? So I'm trying to find out what you are trying to preserve against neo-colonialistic influence.
So Inky, do you have a particular person you're directing that to, or just open? Who would like to begin to tackle the question? Carlos? Well, I think we can hear in this room. These mics are for the people in cyberspace.
Los dos Esto es un micrófono, los dos pueden.
No, this is a microphone for people in cyberspace. Oh, you might hear.
Carlos will also, no? Accompany me.
It depends on what you answer.
No, I wanted to respond because I was the one who historically presented the issue that in the history of Cuba, we are talking about the 16th century, the Aborigines were exterminated by the colonial powers, Spanish colonial power. But at the same time, from the very beginning, I mentioned that the first Spanish that came to Cuba brought African slaves. So our culture, in a process of 500 years, our culture is a syncretic mixed culture with Hispanic, the influence of North Africa in Spain, and the influence of what is called Black Africa in Cuba. And we have our own process during all these 500 years of establishing a very particular way of being and culture, Cuban culture. And I guess for the ones of you who have been in Cuba, you can easily see that. The way we act, the way we express ourselves, our music, our values. Patricia was the influence of the African was very important in our values of family, of the relation between the family. It's true that for us, family is not only son, daughter, grandmother, is cousin, second cousin, third cousin, and we have an understanding, but also the neighborhood. So we have a very strong community culture, communitarian culture. That my personally fear in this process is that we can be influenced by a very individualistic culture from especially from the U.S., against that. And I think those are the challenges, no? I think, for example, the issue, the tension, 2 days ago or 3 days ago in Havana, an exposition at Chanel, these very expensive perfumes for rich people. And suddenly you have that in Cuba, in a place where we have talked that have a lot of the families have a lot of economical problems, and that's a tension. It's not bad to know and to see, but how that will influence in an individualistic perspective in our society is the challenge. So, and also the issue of Obama was speaking of the private business. I personally think that is more related with our Christian conception to make cooperative than to make my own private business. And I think the churches are challenged us, although we have to accept that reality. That means that it's also in people progress in that. But this tension between, and we had Patricia and I with our son about 2 weeks ago, about up to 3 o'clock in the morning. This tension, they live in Miami, no? This tension between individualism and collectivism, our understanding of that we are a community, that tension, I think that is the issue, no?
That's part of it.
Thank you.
Could I
Yes,
just,
please.
sorry, one. I want to apologize with my brother Reinerio because I jumped on the question even when I didn't address it. I think the question makes a lot of sense. How to share a spirituality of a community that has been exterminated. It sounds contradictory. That's the case of Cuba. But there is where we see the value of the ecumenical movement. No? For example, Jim Hudson and we just participated in Guatemala less than 1 month ago in a meeting, in El Salvador, where the moderator of the UCC came with a delegation of First Nations here of Canada to talk about the victims, those that were victims of the boarding schools here. No? And we could make that connection between what a member of the delegation was sharing. Her spirituality is a First Nation. She combined it with the, let's say, so-called Western Christian spirituality. No? The same with Guatemala, for example. No? When we have the opportunity through the ecumenical movement to meet other indigenous people, since we no longer have them in Cuba, there is where we have the opportunity of interacting, to be in dialogue. For example, the spirituality of the earth. Part of the problem of capitalism and the so-called development paradigm is that we are consuming the natural resources of our descendants, no? But when we have the opportunity of relating with indigenous people of Guatemala, etc., they talk about el buen vivir, no? Spirituality of the earth. All this type of spirituality can help us, I think, to strengthen our struggle, so to say, against the neo-colonial Western powers.
Thank you. Question at the back?
Hi, so my name is Carolina, and I'm a psychiatrist here at the University of Toronto. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for these fascinating, inspiring, fabulous, excellent presentations. The reason why I'm here is because I did a PhD doctoral work at the University of British Columbia, where I studied the relationship between globalization and global mental health. So through my journey, I went to Cuba to look at many different aspects of the Cuban's mental health. And I'm here to try to understand where am I now, maybe 7 years later, right? Because there's a great intersect, right, between spirituality, mental health, psychiatry, Santeria, religion in general. And it was quite a journey in terms of trying to bring the learnings that, I was really fortunate to receive in Cuba and apply them here to the Canadian, mental health service, Canadian mental health care system at CAMH, where is our, the largest psychiatric hospital here. And here at the University of Toronto, now working with students, right? Like our international students, we have also a large proportion of Latin American students here anyway. So I have 2 questions for you. And by the way, I'm from El Salvador as well. And so yeah, I, of course, get the concept of spirituality, indigenous people, and especially everything in the context of El Salvador, previous civil war. Anyway, so I don't know if this is a fair question, but from the theological perspective, religious perspective, psychological perspective, Dr. Patricia, what, if any, do you see any changes in terms of the mental health of the Cuban population? And what do you think would be the challenges for the present and for the future in this process of normalization between the relationship between Cuba and the United States?
Realmente,
Sí, claro que sí, sí.
Sí, pero para los demás.
A los demás, Neto, aquí, ven con Patricia, tú traduces lo que yo.
Sí, pero cuando igual, tiene el micrófono.
Ah, el micrófono.
Aquí, por aquí, Néstor, por aquí mismo, entre los dos. Realmente uno piensa que el desarrollo, mientras más desarrollado es un país desde el punto de vista económico,
Really, one thinks that the more developed a country is in terms of economics,
se piensa que hay una correlación lineal entre el bienestar y el desarrollo social.
people often think that there is a correlation between economic wealth and psychological well-being.
Y es interesante porque muchas veces países muy desarrollados tienen problemas sociales como el suicidio, la soledad.
And it is interesting because sometimes developed countries have problems such as suicide,
La soledad,
loneliness,
la drogadicción,
drug addiction,
las personas sin hogar.
people homeless.
Entonces uno se pregunta, ¿realmente el desarrollo económico es lo que produce la salud mental y el bienestar?
So one would really have to wonder whether economic development really leads to health development or mental health.
Y eso es interesante para los indicadores de salud mental en Cuba.
And that is very important for the indicators of mental health in Cuba.
Porque hay algo de nuestra realidad social que tiene que ver con los valores sociales.
Because there is something about our mental health that has to do with social realities.
Y estos valores sociales son un elemento favorecedor de la salud.
And so social values are often, in our case, favor mental health.
Yo que trabajo con terapia en personas en Cuba,
So as someone who works with therapy with people in Cuba,
el problema en Cuba no es la soledad,
the problem in Cuba is not loneliness.
no es el aislamiento,
It's not isolation.
no hay una depresión profunda donde las personas quieran quitarse la vida con mucha frecuencia.
It's not a deep depression where people might want to commit suicide.
El problema en Cuba es el exceso de acompañamiento.
I guess you all understood that, but the problem in Cuba is to have too many people.
Lo que trabajamos nosotros son temas de límites entre las generaciones, entre los vecinos.
Those who work, thus like me, who work in terms of questions in neighborhoods.
Porque yo creo que hay un elemento importante del modo de vida del cubano que fue su estilo de vivir, su modo de vida.
I think that there is a lot about the Cuban people that relates deeply to the lifestyle of Cuban people.
La crisis económica, las personas lograron salir a partir de la solidaridad.
The economic crisis that we had, I think that people were able to overcome it precisely because of those social relations they had.
Entonces un poco Cuba va como en sentido contrario a cómo va el mundo.
So in a way, Cuba is running opposite than the direction of the world.
Y es un asunto interesante desde el punto de vista de análisis social.
And that is an important issue to keep in mind in terms of mental health analysis.
Porque el mundo va hacia el individualismo, hacia la privatización de la vida.
Because in many places, people are running in the direction of individualism, and the privatization of life
hacia valores más individuales como el éxito, el logro, la fama.
towards values that are more individuals like success, fame.
Hoy la axiomática social hoy es yo me ocupo de mi vida, tú te ocupas de tu vida.
So the central axis today is I worry about my life, just personal, individualistic concerns.
Pero los que han ido a Cuba se pueden dar cuenta que incluso las personas que viven solas nunca están solas.
But those people that go to Cuba realize that even those people that live alone don't feel alone.
Las personas disponen de
Lonely.
muchas redes, de un tejido social muy grande.
They have access of a great web of relations that helps them, the social networks.
Creo que esa es la fortaleza más grande que tiene la sociedad cubana.
I think that's one of the greatest strengths that the social Cuban
Y
context
no
has.
quiere decir que no haya problemas económicos graves, difíciles,
And that is not to say that there are no economic problems that are really terrible.
pero cuando un cubano va a mi consulta, habla de los otros, no de él mismo.
But when a Cuban goes to see me, they usually talk about someone else, not about themselves.
Empiezan hablando de los hijos, de la pareja, de los vecinos, y
They
digo,
begin to talk about their children, their neighbors, their husbands, their
¿cuándo
wives.
me vas a hablar de ti?
And so how come you're not talking to me about you?
Es como si tuviésemos una red social de contención.
It is almost as if we Cubans have an imprinted social network here in the mind.
Entonces los indicadores de suicidio, de aislamiento, de problemas graves de salud mental
So the indicators of suicide, or isolation and mental problems
no son considerados problemas severos de salud en Cuba.
are not considered as severe problems in Cuba.
Muchas gracias, doctora Patricia.
And then over here. Okay.
15 years ago, this month, I was in Cuba doing a study leave in the church. I spent some time in the First Presbyterian Reformed Church in Havana and some time in the Seminario in Matanzas. And I was privileged to be there when students were presenting their theses, their licentiate theses. It blew my mind, among other things, that when students were presenting their theses, their children and their wives were in the courtyard and sort of going back and forth between the meeting hall and the patio outside, and the flow of family into this whole academic exercise was very striking to me. But one of the theses that was presented was about the Christian project of reconciliation. And the thesis had three parts. One was about the scriptural doctrine of reconciliation. One was about the sort of systematic theological understanding of reconciliation. But the third part was, how do you apply this? And the particular thing that the student was presenting as a project that we have to embrace is, how do you bring about reconciliation when the day comes that all those guys in Florida who haven't suffered with us or lived with us in the island experience for all these decades, and who have worked against us politically, want to come back. And that the student was positive about taking on this project, but discussion made me realize that there was a brick wall in the minds of a lot of the people in there about how you would even start. And it reminded me, I was in Nicaragua previously and was reading theological journals with the Sandinista bent, and they had the same problem. How do you apply the Christian project of reconciliation to the rich? But this is a particular case of that. And I wonder if a student was tackling this project today at Matanzas, would they run into the same brick wall, or is it something that you have been able to think about or conceive?
Un comentario, una pregunta.
hablar solo.
It's a big challenge. Well, thank you for the question. I think it's very important, and I actually think that it is one of the biggest challenges we have as society and as church as well. And I don't really know how to respond to that. It's a big challenge for me personally. We have a lot of colleagues, pastors in Cuba, young pastors from my generation, that they emigrated to the US. They abandoned the church, for example. In 10 years, maybe 10 pastors in a small church with a lot of problems. They decide to emigrate or to abandon a mission during a visit to a partner church in the US. So it's difficult, you know. They are my brothers and sisters. They are my colleagues. But at the same time, I think there is an ethical issue there, right? So it's something that I am wrestling with, and I think it's a big challenge not only for Cubans here, but for Cubans in the U.S. Hopefully, the new generations of Cuban Americans and Cuban immigrants to the U.S. are changing the mindset of the social imaginary in both places. So I think it's going to be possible someday, but it brings also many challenges. But because what does it mean to reconcile to each other? To go to Cuba, to try to bring the same system you have there, and what about the dynamics? And I don't know how to explain that, but it's very complicated, and many challenges more than now they are come to emerge at that time, because economically, for example, they are in a very better position than many Cubans in the island. So how is going to be those relationships? I don't know. It's tough. That's my answer. My honest answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There was a
Can I add something?
Yeah. Oh, yes, please.
I just wanted to add, because I was the tutor of that thesis. It was the thesis of Daniel Izquierdo.
Yeah.
So I was the advisor, you call it here, no? But it's very complex, because at the same time, if you go, we were talking about that at lunchtime. If you go to the airport of Havana, in Terminal 2, where the flights from Miami come, they come with a lot of families, and this relation of family has been maintained, and you see the families gathering together. So Ary is totally right. There are some issues and some other issues, so it's very complex, very complex. And I think I agree with Ary. It's a great challenge, especially in our perspective from the church, from our commitment. It's an ethical issue. It's very, very complex. But I wanted just to emphasize that this complexity is not black and white. That means if you go there, you will see hundreds of families waiting. The whole family is waiting, no? For somebody that comes, that stays, that goes. That's a problem that they have now with the Cuban adjustment law, no? Because the Cubans can go easy to the U.S. because they are persecuted, and they say they are persecuted in Cuba, but 3 months later they come back to Cuba to visit the family. So it's an issue that it's politically used, but it's very complex, and we have to face that and act honestly. That's why Daniel, in his third part of the thesis, it was very difficult for him to do that. And he's still working on that theme.
Well, it's nothing from, I agree with him 100%, and it's nothing about reconciliation, but sometimes when you want to get somewhere, you have to build the ladder and you have to make the steps. So from the political point of view, from the government, I think one of the steps that are going to lead somehow to that is that Cuba has engaged in a migratory reform. So you have to first change the migratory policy to get to a reconciliation. So for more than now 3 years, since 2013, there's a new migratory policy in law. But since 1994, the government engaged in a new relation between what they call the nation and the immigration. So there are meetings in Havana from time to time where not only people from the US, but from around the world, they come to Cuba, Cubans that live abroad, that they have different walks of life. So they come and they meet with authorities, with civil society. And from 2013, not only we changed the rules from the Cubans outside, but the Cubans inside Cuba. So the Cubans now, they can travel freely without renouncing or giving up anything. The Cubans that live abroad, they can come to Cuba freely or without less bureaucracy, and they can participate in the new economic development. So, be it by not very legally. I mean, there are no laws that are shaping that future, but at the family point of view, at the family level, they are engaging on the new development of Cuba. So that's another way of building, you know, the steps to go to your question.
Thank you. We have a question here. I see all sorts of hands up. I had 2 hands up before I had to look at the time. So these 2 will be the last question. They're not going anywhere. We're going off to have a lovely reception. Mark's going to talk about that, so you'll have opportunities to approach each of them individually if there are questions or comments you want to make. That's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. As a lay person, a Canadian without much experience or knowledge of the Cuban condition, I want to express how grateful I am to have had the privilege of having this illustrious panel discuss what you have today. We're very grateful. This is not really a question for your panel, but a request specifically to you, Ary. If you could make available what you presented today in writing. I think what you said.
It's part of my thesis.
I had a suspicion. I want first to say to you that I understand you in English at the speed at which you speak almost as well as I do in Spanish.
Thank you.
It would be very much easier for me to follow what you said if I could read it. Would that be possible?
No.
Yes. No?
Impossible or possible?
Would that be possible?
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you.
I think we probably could arrange to get it and upload it on the website so that you would have access to it. Joe, we can do that, right?
Yes, or yes.
Yes, and
Wait for the book.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Warden. I'm with Kairos, and thank you very much for the presentations. They were wonderful. Kairos is an ecumenical organization, and there's a long history of ecumenical solidarity between Canada and Cuba. In fact, I think it was in 1996, it was the first time that the Canadian government offered money, international cooperation for Cuban civil society organizations. I was working at the Canadian Council of Churches at that time, and we made an application, and I think we were the first organization to get funding from CEDA at that time to support the churches in Cuba and the ecumenical organizations in Cuba. So there's a long history of that sort of support. My question is whether the churches and civil society is involved in the decentralization or this normalization process that you're referring to of the government. Is the government involving civil society in this, the decentralization process, and how are the churches involved in that?
Decentralization.
Perhaps I can start giving some. Well, first of all, I think we have to see the participation of the churches as part of the civil society, not only in terms of what can we share materially, but also from the spiritual point of view. We engage in a lot of meetings, high-level meetings with representatives of our party and of our government. And quite often, what the leaders of our state is asking the churches to accompany the Cuban people through sharing spiritual values, no? Values like the one that Patricia mentioned, no? Of solidarity and accompaniment, etc. The churches, this is one of the things that we were trying to say in the panel. The churches, at least our churches here, of the Protestant churches, our approach of social engagement is not to compete against the government as other, let's say, circles would, or perhaps churches would. Our agenda is to work in collaboration with the government, regardless of any political, ideological affiliation. Because what we want is to work towards the welfare of our government, of our people, and the unity of the people. So therefore, we engage in different levels of the authorities, working together, providing support, pastoral support, providing our infrastructure, etc. Providing quite often, for example, Reinerio was mentioning the other day, a big hurricane that came through Matanzas city, where our seminary is. Many people lost their houses. The seminary provide shelter for a number of days. So that means that we are working in a spirit of collaboration as part of the civil society. But the thing is that we have discovered is that when we prepare the new pastors and the new leadership of the church, we realize that we are not preparing them well enough to face this new situation of, let's say, social engagement. And there's where, again, we're trying to work on the curriculum, etc., in such a way that we can not only form pastors as in a traditional way, but also as community facilitators that can engage in collaboration with other sectors of society, including the government, for the well-being of the people, particularly those in greatest need.
Mark, get you to come up.
Before we finish, I wanted to say something.
Sure. Yes.
No, because we didn't mention it. I think it's something that all of us are very agree on. The importance of the relation with the churches and our brothers and sisters in Canada. I want to emphasize that. In this new situation that we have, in these new challenges that we have, is very important. The dialogue, the collaboration with our brothers and sisters in Canada. I know from some Canadians that you don't like to go to the beach when there are others from the continent. But please, don't abandon us. Please do not, because you have supported us during all these years. You have accompanied us, and I think we need you. We still need you very much. So that is something I think is in the spirit of all of us. Yeah. So that's a call. Don't abandon us. Maintain that solidarity.
I just want, on behalf of all of us gathered here this afternoon, to thank each of our 5 Cubans, our panelists, for this excellent presentation. In each case, you teased several things that each one of you said, don't have time to deal with that right now, that raised a whole lot of interesting possibilities for further discussion and conversation. And I think you can tell by the questions, there's just a tremendous interest in learning more about the Cuban realities today.
You
and
can
the
invite us
challenges.
again to come back.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I did want to say, not only we learned a great deal today, but we also recognize there's a great deal we could learn from Cuba. And especially as we consider the family networks, the community relationships that are so natural to the Cuban cultural realities. And we in North America, both in the United States and Canada, have much to learn from you about those important connections. And we also pray that in this new era of normalization of relations, that you can avoid catching various viruses from us, and particularly the virus from the south of our border, the DT virus, the individualism associated with Donald Trump and others like him. So thank you for raising so many interesting points for us today. I would now invite all of us to cross the hall here and continue conversations over a glass of wine or some other little eats. Yeah, so thank you very much.
That's a good one. That's good. Thank you.